It's time for another edition of PRosé with Vicki Locke and Cindy Woolley from C2 Communications.
Hi, everybody. I'm Vicki Locke, and on a sad note, Cindy is not going to be able to be with us for happy hour, so I'm toasting her today. There was a death in the family. It was sudden, and we are thinking about you, Cindy, and wish you were here, but we know you're going to be here next week, and all my love to you. So our guest today, on a happy note, she was a sports writer at the age of 16 in St. Petersburg and in Tampa Bay. She wrote for the Tampa Bay All Sports magazine. So I've got to ask her about the Olympics. She's a graduate of the University of Florida, so I hope she doesn't hate me because I'm a graduate of Ohio State, so we're kind of enemies. She's been a reporter for People magazine. She's just a rock star. She is a New York Times best-selling author, a #1 international best-selling author. You know her books. There's zillions of them. It's Kristin Harmel, and she joins us right now. And cheers to you.
Hi, cheers. Thanks for having me.
So before we get into your book, your latest book, which I haven't finished yet, which I just love, The Forest of Vanishing Stars. I want to ask you a little bit about the Olympics and being a reporter. And as a former sports reporter, what do you think about the Norwegian women's team, the handball team, that got fined because they didn't want to wear the itsy bitsy bottoms?
Oh my gosh, those bottoms. That was such a crazy story. There are so many just unusual stories, I feel like, circulating around these Olympics. But I've got to say, despite the fact that I come from a sports writing background, which was a long time ago, in our family, my husband is really the Olympics guy. Like he lives for the Olympics every year. So yes, we have had the Olympics on every night, but he would be the better person to ask any Olympic question to.
So how did you get to writing sports? It was just kind of like a beat and you wanted to be a writer. And so you said you just dove right in?
No, gosh, no. I used to think I wanted to be a sports writer. I mean, that was my career. That was my career goal. But I started when I was 16. So, I started off by covering minor league baseball, which turned into assignments covering Major League Baseball and NHL hockey and NFL football, which was kind of cool. But what I kind of discovered along the way was that although I thought what I wanted to do was write sports, what I really loved about writing sports was telling the stories behind the athletes. So I liked exploring and digging deep into what made them the elite athletes they had turned into. You know what I mean? Because it's not just that they were physically gifted, which obviously that was a component. But they were all people who had worked very hard to get where they were. There was a very big mental component to it. I was always interested in what kind of upbringing had led them to that place. And the more I realized that that's what I was really drawn to, the more I realized that what I really, really was doing and really was drawn to doing was writing about people, which has kind of been at the core of what I've been doing ever since.
And you and I have two things in common. You lived briefly in Worthington, Ohio. Correct?
I did. Yeah, okay. Until I was 10. Yep.
And that's where I grew up in Ohio. And
wait, you grew up in Worthington or just
no? I grew up in Canton, and then I went to Ohio State, which is a long line of people that went to Ohio State in my family. Cool. And the second thing is a book that changed my life was The Diary of Anne Frank. And I understand you feel the same way.
Yeah. And, I think it's probably a book that's been influential in so many lives. And I think that probably speaks to why that book mattered so much to me, because that was the book that made me realize that books could change the world by changing the way people feel and the way people think and the way people look at a situation. I think prior to reading that book, I thought books were just for entertainment. And so reading that book was really a revelation that set me on the path that I'm on now. I had always wanted to be a writer, but I also wanted to be somebody who changed the world and who made, a positive difference in the world. And that book was the one that taught me that I could do both.
And I hope you realize that you really are changing the world with... I want to thank Allie Harris, actually, who introduced me to your books years and years ago, and also say hi to my Aunt Rosemary, to Molly Locke, to Tara and Joni Locke, all huge fans of yours. My niece Molly is actually watching you right now in Germany, where she's stationed in the U.S. Air Force.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, thank you for your service. That's
So,
amazing.
why so much historical fiction about World War II?
That time period fascinates me. I think that Anne Frank was part of what drew me into that initially. And then when I was writing for People magazine later on, when I was in my 20s, I had the opportunity to interview a really amazing Holocaust survivor who had been in concentration camps from the age of 13 to the age of 18, and talking about the psychological impact of that time of his life on him. I think kind of reignited my fire for exploring that time period, exploring the Holocaust, and writing about it. So that led to my first novel, or my first World War II novel, The Sweetness of Forgetting, which came out in 2012. And once I wrote that, it kind of opened up the floodgates, because there are so many stories that haven't been told fully or that we've never heard. And they're all so relevant to today. Like even though they're stories that are 75 or 80 years in the past, they have such great relevance. And I just find them really compelling to explore and to tell.
And I'm looking, there's people tuning in from Nevada, from South Carolina, and back to the World War II and the stories that you're telling. And you talk about 75 to 80 years. Thank goodness that you're telling them, because pretty soon there won't be anyone left. There won't be any Holocaust survivors left to tell these tales.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And I do think it's important to remember. I mean, there are so many lessons from World War II that we need to keep with us. For the Forest of Vanishing Stars, one of the people I had the chance to talk to was someone who was a refugee in the forests of Eastern Poland, and survived the war that way as part of a group led by his older brothers. And talking with him was such a gift, but he's 94. I mean, he was 14, 15, and 16 during the time he was hiding in the woods, and now he's 94. And so you're absolutely right. We are running out of the years where we'll be able to talk to people who were old enough during that time to have understood what was happening and to recount those stories.
Has he read the book, and what did he say?
I don't know that he has yet. I have not heard that he has. So it just came out a couple weeks ago. So
And maybe it's did you see the documentary about Tina Turner?
No. Mm-mm.
Well, you know the movie, What's Love Got to Do with It, right?
Sure, of course, yeah.
Right. Well, in my radio days, I got a chance to interview her after that movie came out.
Yeah.
And she wanted to talk about the music. And
Yeah.
I remember thinking, I wanted, if I get the chance, to apologize to her, because in the documentary, she was saying that was a part of her life, even though it was her life, that she wanted to forget. She didn't want to relive it every day and every interview.
Of course.
So maybe the survivor that you spoke to, and he gave you this wealth of information, which the book is just so amazing. It's probably different for him to read something that he lived.
Maybe. Yeah. Yeah. Also probably English maybe isn't the language he's as comfortable reading, since, so that might be a challenge too. It might make more sense.
But aren't your books in every language?
They are. They're in a bunch of languages, but usually the English language one comes out first. And so, for instance, the Polish edition hasn't come out yet. So when the Polish edition comes out, I'll certainly send that his way too.
This question is for Cindy, who is a nerd. I mean that with love. The Book of Lost Names. You are a math nerd, or were. Correct?
Yes. Yeah. When I was a kid.
He is too.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. So at the heart of the Book of Lost Names is, so the Book of Lost Names is about a French forger in World War II, who helps save the lives of hundreds of children by giving them forged identity papers, and keeps track of the children's names in a book that she refers to as the Book of Lost Names. But the code that she uses to encode their names in the Book of Lost Names does have a mathematical sequence at its core. The code is based on a mathematical sequence called the Fibonacci sequence. And the reason that that ties into me being a math nerd as a kid was that it took me months to figure out what code I was going to use in the book. And I really went down, the research rabbit hole of, what was going on at Bletchley Park and what were codes the military was using. And ultimately, none of that made sense because two amateur forgers in a little church library in rural France were not going to be having access or the knowledge of the codes that the military was using. And so it just came to me in a flash one day, the Fibonacci sequence, which I used to lie in when I was in third grade and run in my head as mental gymnastics, because my goal in third grade, I just had this crazy idea that I was going to be the first kid to solve the world's unsolvable math problems. So the Fibonacci sequence was like how I was like mentally challenging myself to get up to speed for that ultimate goal. What a dork, right?
So funny. Yeah. I am the worst in math. I mean, the absolute worst. I even invert numbers. When people tell me a phone number, thank God for cell phones now,
right.
They'll say, you probably got it wrong. That's how bad I am.
That's funny.
And switching real quick to the winemaker's wife, who my sister-in-law, Joni, just was telling me that she just read. Do you like wine?
I do. Yes, I like wine very much.
And I remember reading, I'm trying to remember now, did you visit vineyards when you wrote that book? I mean, it's just, it makes me want to travel so badly back to see vineyards, to taste the scenery. And it just was such a wonderful trip for me.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So the winemaker's wife is set in Champagne, France. So the family at the heart of the winemaker's wife runs a champagne house. So yes, I did go and spend time in Champagne and visit many champagne houses and speak with champagne makers and historians and all sorts of things. But that was great. It was not a hardship to have to travel to Champagne to research that book.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
And now to your current book, The Forest of Vanishing Stars. What is it? Just you're always thinking about World War II characters, because I know you do love that part of history, or how do these things come into your head? Do you have dreams? How does it happen?
Well, it usually starts with the research. When I have kind of the nugget of an idea of a story I want to tell. So for instance, with the Book of Lost Names, I had the idea that I kind of was interested in looking into how people became document forgers and what was involved with that, because my two previous novels have been set in World War II France, and both previous novels had forged documents in them. And I started thinking, well, who forged these documents? How did you get into that? What were the risks of doing that? I kind of had all these questions myself. So that story grew out of those questions. This story, I think, just grew out of wanting to do something different. I wanted to still write about World War II, but I had written several books in World War II France, several books with a relatively urban setting, and I wanted to do something that wasn't that just forced me a little bit out of my comfort zone to kind of grow myself as a writer, to grow my storytelling, just spread my wings a little bit.
Somebody just asked why Poland, why you decided to set it in Poland.
There was no real reason other than that I had read stories about refugees who fled into the forests there, which is the story I was interested in telling. I wanted to tell a story set in the forests, and that was an area where a lot of people did flee into, these really heavily wooded areas and lived out the war that way. But interestingly, it was midway through writing the book that I discovered that the Jewish side of my own family on my dad's side had actually come from an area of Poland not that far away from where the characters in my book live. So I don't know. That's very interesting to me that I was drawn to write about Poland for no particular reason, but that it turned out those stories were in my blood kind of all along,
And do you live alongside when you're writing these? Because right now, Yona, the main character in the book, I already see what she looks like. So if they do the movie, I will be so upset if she's not exactly how I'm picturing her. But I just feel an energy when I'm reading and running through the forest with her. I feel like I'm her, and love that so much.
That's awesome. Thank you. Thank you.
Somebody else is asking right now, have you ever considered writing about Anne Frank's life as it was after the end of her diary?
Oh, hey, I see that question's from Marlene. Thank you, Marlene. You always ask great questions. No, I don't. I'm not a person who tells real people's stories. Some authors do that tremendously well. Marie Benedict comes to mind. She does a great job of writing historical fiction based on real life historical figures, biographical fiction, you would call it. That's not me. I take real time periods. I base the characters oftentimes loosely on real people, but I kind of consider Anne Frank hallowed ground almost. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
I, I, and I think it would be difficult to know exactly what happened to her, although a lot has been written about what happened to her after the end of her diary. But I think there would be too many blanks to fill in for me to feel comfortable fictionalizing that and doing justice to the real story. Great question, though, Marlene.
When's the last time you were really inspired by a novel that you read, other than something of your own?
Oh, I'm inspired, honestly, anytime I read a novel that's well written, which is almost all the time. I mean, I'm always reading something because I'm asked so frequently to blurb other people's books, which means to give kind of like a cover quote or an endorsement for their books. So, those are always a privilege because I'm getting to read them early. Sometimes I'm getting to read writers at the very beginning of their careers. Sometimes I'm getting to read writers who are where I am in my career, which is an honor too. And there's always something different that different writers bring to the table, and I feel so inspired after every book. That honestly, almost every book I read, I feel like I walk away with something new because I'm just so amazed at a way they've turned a phrase, or a way they described a setting which hadn't been something I'd thought of before. Or I think there's inspiration in everything, and I love reading about World War II in particular. And I find so many World War II stories really inspiring and compelling. So yeah, I'm inspired all the time.
Do you have any mentors? Probably not, since you've been writing since you were 16 years of age.
Yeah, I don't know if I would call anybody a mentor for me, but I mean, I certainly have writers I'm very close to, who I work closely with. I have an online show called Friends in Fiction with four other writers: Mary Kay Andrews, Mary Alice Monroe, Patty Callahan Henry, and Christy Woodson Harvey. And the four of them are peers who I enormously respect and who I talk to literally every day. I mean, we're on the world's longest text string. We do a show together on Wednesdays, but we have a meeting every Thursday. We text each other probably 50 times a day. I have found myself, particularly in the last year and a half since we've been doing this show together, very guided by their wisdom. And again, I wouldn't call any of them mentors. I feel like we're kind of more peers,
Mhm.
but some of them are at points in their career where they've been doing this a little bit longer than me, and that is a wonderful example to look at, and kind of soak in the wisdom that they're able to share.
And it's so great because it's women supporting women,
Yeah.
and all of you write about really powerful women, and that must be important to you. Because I
Yeah.
remember as a little kid, I'm older than you are, watching a TV show, and all the doctors were men. So while you were off wanting to solve math problems like Good Will Hunting, I
Yeah.
remember telling my mom, I'm going to be the first female doctor, just assuming that there weren't any.
They weren't. Yeah. Wow. That's crazy. Yeah. I think it's important to empower all people. And yes, I think women have probably been, I mean, not probably, certainly been overlooked historically, even as recently as the last few years. So I do think it's important to keep telling stories of strong women, and women who do defy the odds, and women who are ahead of their time. But as the mother of a son too, I also am really conscious not to not to turn the tables too far and say like, well, now we have to elevate women in everything. Like it should just be an equal playing field for all of us. You know what I mean? Like we should all be encouraged to achieve, and we should all be encouraged to support each other. And I think the closer we can get to that ideal where we're all lifting each other up and there aren't barriers to anything, to any career that you dream of, I think the world will be a better place if we can get closer to that. And we're moving in that direction. I mean, I think there are fewer and fewer obstacles uh, for women now, but it's so cool to hear from women who have been trailblazers. Like I met a woman last week who she was in the Navy. She was a pilot in the Navy, and she was the first woman ever to land a plane or a jet on an aircraft carrier, which I thought that was kind of cool. Like that was a little,
Wow.
at a time when they said women couldn't do that, women can't fly like this. And she was like, well, yes, I can. And she did. So, and she was one of the first pilots, I think it was for Delta also. So she was just interesting. So it's always inspiring to meet people who see an obstacle and just say, well, I'm going through anyways,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what does Kristin Harmel do on her time off, if in fact you have any time off?
I spend time with my son. I have a 5-year-old. I have a 5-year-old who's been very cheated out of mom time in the last year and a half because I've been so busy trying to get The Forest of Vanishing Stars written and trying to get my next book that I'm working on now written. And, I've done over 200 virtual events in the last year and a half, and all of that has taken time away from him. So I really try to be very conscious of giving some of that time back when I can, because I realize that these years are going to be fleeting, and I don't want to look back with too much regret over choices I made. So, that's some of it. We live about 25 minutes from Disney World. So we go to Disney World a lot. We like going to the beach. I like drinking wine. As you mentioned, I am a wine drinker. That's always enjoyable. Cheers. Exactly. And I like to cook. I like to read. I like to travel when the world is open. So all of those things. And honestly, there's not a lot of spare time these days, though, because just, even if you set aside all the work I do for my books, Friends and Fiction takes up an enormous amount of time. So it leaves me with very little breathing room at the end of the day.
And you mentioned that your next book you're working on. Can you give us any idea what it's going to be about?
Sure. It's a return to World War II France. It is about two mothers, two daughters, an Allied bomb that drops where it shouldn't in a suburb of Paris, a family torn apart, and then a storyline in 1960 New York that pieces together sort of these shattered fragments of the past.
I think it's in The Forest of Vanishing Stars when you talk about broken hearts and jagged edges, but coming together to make it whole. I totally butchered your line.
No, that was good. That was actually better than I could have
done. Do you like, if you're watching movies, do you like sad movies? No, I'm just thinking because your books are just kind of rip at your heart, most of them. So I just wondered if that's your genre in movies.
I mean, I do like sad movies, but I really like happy movies too. I think I like the movies that have that perfect balance between the sad and the sweet, like the sad and the joyful. So like Love Actually, for example, is one of my very favorite movies. And movie has heartbreak in it, but it's ultimately an uplifting movie. So I think that's kind of my thing. And I think that's kind of hopefully what you'll find in my books too. It's not just sad. It's not just heartbreaking. I hope that overwhelmingly what you walk away from my books is sort of a story of light in the darkness and story of hope shining through even in the dark times.
And did you have the greatest childhood? Because your books also, to me, it seems like family is so important to you.
Oh yeah, I mean, gosh, I did have a great childhood, but and family was always at the heart of that, and family is at the heart of my life now. I mean, it's I think it's so important, and I think that's why I write about that. I write about how family is kind of everything, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the family that you're born with or the family that raises you. I mean, for me, I had a wonderful experience with the family I was born into and the family, that I'm actually related to. But I think also in life, you can choose your own family along the way. Those friends that are going to be with you forever, they kind of become your family. The person you choose to marry, the children you have, like, I guess those are your actual family. But, I just think there's a lot of ways you can build family too. So family to me doesn't just mean biological family. It means the family you kind of put together along the way.
That's so beautiful. It's so beautiful, Kristin. And do you have any advice for people that think, how does she do it? She's written all these books. She's got a family. She does have time for herself. She's trying to make time for her son. She feels a little jilted, a little bad. You shouldn't, because I'm sure he's well adjusted and so happy. But it's where do you find time during the day? Is it just, okay, I'm going to be writing from 9 to 3, or I'm going to just do it Monday, Wednesday, and Friday? Are you really disciplined?
Well, it's my job. So I work, I work every day.
Every day, every single day?
Yeah. So in a normal world, not a COVID world, I write every day when he's in school. But he was not in school this whole last year. So this last year was a little bit upside down for us. So this last year I wrote from like 6 to 8:30 in the morning. Every day, and then I would start my day with him, and then I worked on weekends too. I wrote every Saturday and Sunday until 2 or until 4 or whatever, whatever time I could carve out. My husband was with him then. He is starting kindergarten in about 2 weeks, so I think I'm hopefully going back to a 5-day-a-week schedule, probably with some weekends thrown in, because right now my book deadline is November 1st, which is going to be kind of tight for me to make, considering how much I still have to write on this book. So it'll probably be a 5-day-a-week plus a weekend day schedule from now until November.
And your friend Patty Callahan, she was saying that she has, I think she has the ending done first and then puts it together. How do you work? Do you have, okay, you've got the story in your brain. Do you have the ending already? Do you make changes? Do you make an outline?
Yeah, I am a serious outliner. So I write a very in-depth, long outline. My outlines usually winds up being between 10 and 20,000 words. And to give you some context, a typical book is around 100,000 words. So my outlines are, a fifth of the length of a finished book. So they're very long and detailed. And by the end of the outline, yes, I do know how the story is going to end. But I also know all the beats along the way to get us there. So once I sit down to begin writing, I already know not just where I'm going eventually, but exactly how I'm going to get there. And the book changes a little bit on the way, along the way. It differs a little from the outline, but it sticks fairly close to it.
So you've never had, say, a character go off the beaten path, so to speak, changed it dramatically ever?
Not dramatically, but I do have, that happens almost every book. The changes between the outline and the first draft are always character driven. So it is always that when I have to make a change, it's always because I get to a point that I foresaw in the outline or that I had planned for in the outline. And when I get there, I realize, oh, wait a minute, this character wouldn't actually do this. That's not, that doesn't fit the personality now that I know this character a little bit better. So those are the changes. And then you kind of have to figure out, okay, if they're not going to do this, how do I get back onto the track that I need to be on to get to the end, but respecting this character's journey? So yes, that's a good question. All of those changes are because of character, characters kind of going off on their own.
And do you cry along with us?
I cry during the outline process when I realize that I have to kill people off, or when I realize something really tragic has to happen. Because it hits me probably the way that it hits the reader when they read it. It hits me with surprise when I realize I have to do it, even though it's kind of a build and you kind of realize probably in a World War II novel, not everybody's going to walk out okay, that's just unfortunately World War II. But yes, so I kind of go through the grieving process in the outline. And then by the time I'm writing, I'm more focused on how I'm telling the story because I've already kind of grieved the occurrence, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. I love your work. I know everybody watching loves everything you do. We look for, and do you have a title? Did you say the title of your next book?
The working title is either the French daughter or the Paris daughter, but I'm not sure that's going to be the title that sticks. A lot of times,
Okay.
a lot of the time, the title that I'm envisioning is not the title that we end up going out in the world with. But that's what I'm working with right now.
Well, whatever it is, we're going to be buying. Thank you
Thank
so much for
you.
being on PRosé.
Thank
Best of
you.
luck to you. Hello to your son. And cheers,
you.
Cindy. We're thinking of you.
Yeah,
And we'll
cheers.
see everybody next week.
Take care.
Thanks,
Thank
Kristin.
you. Thanks for having me, Vicky.
Join us next week for another edition of PRosé with Vicky Locke and Cindy Woolley from C2 Communications.